My toxic ex crashed my bookshop event just to humiliate me, right in front of my customers. She laughed, calling me a pathetic failure. My face burned. I froze, bracing for the abuse like I always did. But then, the door chime rang, and the entire room went dead silent. A breathtaking, terrifyingly powerful CEO walked in. She ignored my ex entirely, stepped right in front of me, and did the unthinkable. The bookshop smelled like old paper and cinnamon, and Eleanor thought, for the 100th time that evening, that she should have just canceled the reading. Rachel was standing in the back row, arms crossed, that familiar half-smile curling the corner of her mouth. She had not been invited. She had not been welcome in 2 years. And yet there she was, dressed like she had just walked off a magazine shoot, watching Eleanor like a cat watching a mouse that had gotten too comfortable. "Eleanor, darling," Rachel called out, loud enough to cut through the murmur of the dozen or so neighbors and regulars. "I heard you were doing one of these little events. I had to see it for myself." The room went quiet. Eleanor's hands tightened around the copy of a poetry collection she had been about to read from. The spine creaked under her grip. "Rachel," she said, keeping her voice light, "I didn't know you were back in the city." "Oh, I've been back for months." Rachel stepped forward, heels clicking against the worn hardwood. "I just didn't think you'd want to see me. And I was right, wasn't I? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor forced a smile. The old habit kicked in, the one that smoothed everything over, that made people comfortable, that kept the peace. "It's just a surprise, that's all." "A surprise?" Rachel repeated, savoring the word. She turned to the small crowd, gesturing at the shelves, the mismatched armchairs, the cat asleep on the windowsill. "Look at this! Isn't it adorable, my little Eleanor, playing shopkeeper with her little books? You know, she used to tell me she'd run a bookstore one day. I thought she was joking. I thought she'd grow out of it." The woman next to Rachel, someone Eleanor didn't recognize, laughed a little too loudly. A few others shifted, uncomfortably. Eleanor's face burned. She could feel the familiar knot tightening in her chest, the one that always appeared when Rachel started picking at her. The words were already forming in her throat, the same ones she always used. "It's fine, no harm done. She's just like that." But before she could speak, the door opened. The bell above the door jingled, soft and cheerful, and everyone turned. A woman stepped in, tall, with dark hair pulled back in a low knot and a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire month of rent. She moved like someone who owned the room the moment she entered it, not because she demanded attention, but because she simply existed in a different register than everyone else. The woman's eyes swept the crowd once, cool and assessing, and landed on Eleanor. For a split second something flickered there, something almost like recognition. Then it was gone. "Sorry to interrupt," the woman said. Her voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "I was told there was a poetry reading tonight." Rachel's smile sharpened. "There is. You're just in time to watch the main event being embarrassed in front of her own customers." The woman in the camel coat didn't even look at Rachel. She walked past her, unhurried, and stopped in front of Eleanor. Up close, Eleanor could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her lips pressed together in a thin, patient line. "I'm sorry," the woman said, low enough that only Eleanor could hear. "Am I interrupting something?" Eleanor's throat felt tight. She shook her head, then found her voice. No, you're not. We were just about to start the reading." "Good." The woman turned to Rachel, and her gaze was like a door closing. "I believe the reading is about to begin. If you're not here to listen, the door is behind you." Rachel's face twitched. She opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed, a brittle sound. "Well, isn't that something, Eleanor? You've got yourself a bodyguard now. That's new." "I don't need a bodyguard," Eleanor said, and the words came out steadier than she felt. "I need you to leave, Rachel." The silence stretched. Rachel looked at her, really looked at her, and something flickered behind her eyes, something that might have been hurt or might have been fury. Then she shrugged, turned, and walked out. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click. The room exhaled. Someone started a low murmur of conversation, and the tension slowly dissolved into the familiar hum of a bookshop at evening. Eleanor realized she was still clutching the poetry collection. She loosened her grip, smoothing the cover with a shaking hand, and looked up to thank the stranger. But the woman was already browsing the shelves, her back to Eleanor, fingers trailing along the spines with an easy, unhurried grace. She moved like someone who had nowhere else to be, and yet something about the set of her shoulders suggested she was always aware of the exit. Eleanor cleared her throat. I should probably start the reading. The woman turned, and there was something almost soft in her expression, a gentleness that seemed out of place on such a sharp-boned face. "Whenever you're ready," she said. "I'm not in a hurry." The reading went well, all things considered. Eleanor read 2 poems, fumbled one line, laughed at herself, and the regulars clapped warmly. The woman in the camel coat sat in the back, near the window, and did not clap. She simply watched, hands folded in her lap, the cat eventually wandering over, they think, to curl up against her ankle. When the reading ended, people drifted out in 2s and 3s, saying their goodnights, promising to come back for the next one. Eleanor tidied the chairs, stacking the extra ones against the wall, and tried not to think about Rachel's voice in her head. "Excuse me?" Eleanor turned. The woman was standing at the counter holding 3 books. One was a memoir, one was a collection of essays, and one was a slim volume with a worn blue cover. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew that cover. She had owned the same edition years ago, had read it until the spine cracked, had lost it somewhere in the shuffle of moving out of Rachel's apartment. "That one," Eleanor said, nodding at the slim blue book. "It's out of print. I didn't know I still had a copy on the shelf." The woman looked at it, then back at Eleanor. Her expression was unreadable. "I've been looking for it for a long time." Eleanor rang up the books, her fingers clumsy as she wrapped them in brown paper. "That'll be $34.20. The woman handed her a card. Eleanor ran it through the reader, waited, handed it back. The transaction was smooth, efficient, done. "Thank you," the woman said, picking up the package. She paused at the door, hand on the handle, and glanced back. "I'm sorry about earlier. That woman. She was unkind to you." Eleanor shrugged, the old reflex kicking in. "It's fine. She's just unkind," the woman repeated, cutting her off gently. "That's not something you have to excuse." Then she was gone, the bell jingling softly behind her, and Eleanor was left standing in the quiet bookshop, the scent of cinnamon and old paper settling around her like a blanket. She looked at the counter, where the woman had left a $10 bill on top of the brow. "25 paper wrapper. For the poetry book," she realized. The price had been $6.50. She had paid for the other 2 books with the card, but she had left cash for the poetry book. Exact change, plus a little extra, almost like she had wanted to make sure Eleanor got the full price for it. Eleanor picked up the $10 bill and turned it over. On the back, in neat, precise handwriting, was a single line, "Thank you for reading it aloud. It sounds better in your voice." Eleanor stood there for a long time, holding the bill, the bookshop settling into silence around her. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting amber pools across the sidewalk. She didn't know who the woman was. She didn't know how she had found the bookshop, or why she had stayed for the whole reading, or what she had meant by that note. But she knew one thing for certain. She was going to find out. The next morning, Eleanor came downstairs before the shop opened and stood behind the register with a cup of cinnamon apple tea. She had not slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman in the camel coat, and every time she opened them, she saw the $10 bill propped against the cash register. She had put it in the drawer last night, face down, so she would not have to look at it. But she had also, at 3 in the morning, gotten out of bed and taken it out again, just to read the handwriting one more time. Neat. Precise. Each letter formed with intention, like someone who had learned to write carefully because she had learned early that words could be used against you if you were not careful. The shop bell chimed at 7:45, and her part-time assistant, a college student named Tom, came in with a cardboard tray of 2 coffees. He raised an eyebrow at her. "You look like you want..." "I've been staring at a ghost," he said. "Something like that," Eleanor said, and she slipped the $10 bill into the pocket of her cardigan before he could ask any questions. She spent the morning doing inventory, shelving new arrivals, and trying not to think about the woman. It did not work. She kept replaying the moment the door had opened, the way the entire room had gone quiet, the way Rachel's face had shifted from smug to unsettled. She had never seen anyone make Rachel shut up like that. She had not known it was possible. At noon, she called her friend Priya, who ran a small bakery 2 blocks away. "Did you hear about what happened at the reading last night?" Eleanor asked. "I heard Rachel showed up and made a scene," Priya said. "I also heard some mysterious rich lady swept in and rescued you like a scene out of a movie." "It wasn't like that," Eleanor said, but her cheeks warmed anyway. "She just bought some books and left." "Uh-huh. And left you a note that you're still carrying around in your pocket." Eleanor pulled the bill out of her cardigan and looked at it. "How did you know?" "Because you're calling me at noon, which means you haven't been able to focus all morning." "So who is she?" "I don't know." "Then find out." That afternoon, Eleanor did something she'd never done before. She took the $10 bill to the bank and asked one of the tellers, an older woman named Dottie who had known her since she opened the shop, if she could help her identify anything about it. Dottie looked at the bill, then at Eleanor, then back at the bill. "This is just a regular 10, Dottie said. "But the handwriting is lovely. Is this from a secret admirer?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "It's from a customer. I was just curious." "Mm-hmm." Dottie smiled and handed the peel bill back. "Well, whoever she is, she had nice penmanship. That's rare these days." Eleanor walked back to the bookstore feeling no closer to an answer. The woman had paid with a black card, the kind that did not have a name on it, the kind that meant money was not something she thought about. She had not introduced herself. She had not asked for a receipt. She had simply walked in, listened to Eleanor read poetry for 40 minutes, bought 3 books, and left a note that had kept Eleanor up all night. By the time the shop closed, Eleanor had convinced herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a note. It was just a kind gesture from a stranger. She should let it go. She was locking the front door when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Whitfield, this is Maya Chen, Chief of Staff at Ashford Media. My employer would like to make a donation to your bookstore's children's reading program. Are you available for a brief meeting tomorrow morning?" Eleanor stared at the screen. Ashford Media was one of the biggest media conglomerates in the country. She had never had any contact with them, had never applied for any grant, had never even mentioned her children's reading program outside of a local community board meeting. She typed back, "I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I didn't apply for any donation." The reply came almost instantly. "No mistake. My employer is very specific about the causes she supports. Does 9 a.m. work?" Eleanor looked at the empty street, the dim glow of the streetlights, the $10 bill still folded in her pocket. 9 a.m. works, she typed. "Can I ask who your employer is?" There was a long pause. Then, "She'll introduce herself tomorrow." Eleanor stood outside her bookstore for a long time after the last text came through, her thumb hovering over the screen. The shop's warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk behind her, catching the first few drops of rain that had begun to fall. She thought about the note on the bill again, the neat handwriting, the way the woman had looked at her during the reading, like she was the only person in the room. She did not know why Ashford Media was interested in her little bookstore. She did not know why a woman who could afford anything in the world would leave a $10 bill with a handwritten note for a stranger. But she was going to find out. The rain came down harder as she finally unlocked her door and went back inside, and she did not see the black town car that had been parked across the street for the past hour, its engine idling, its rear window rolled down just enough for a pair of sharp, tired eyes to watch her disappear into the warm light of the shop. Maya Chen sat in the passenger seat and turned to look at her boss. "You could have just sent a check," Maya said. "You didn't have to scare her." Vivian Ashford did not look away from the bookstore window. "I wanted to see her again," she said quietly. "That's all." Maya sighed and reached for her coffee. "I don't trust anyone who smiles that much, you know that, right?" "I know," Vivian said, and then, almost to herself, "but I think she might be worth the risk." The rain kept falling, and the light in the bookstore window stayed on until long past midnight. The next morning, Eleanor changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a cream-colored sweater and her favorite corduroy skirt. She told herself it was because she wanted to look professional for a potential donor. She told herself the flutter in her chest was just anticipation about the children's reading program. She told herself a lot of things, and none of them were true. The coffee in her hand had gone cold by the time 9 o'clock arrived. She had opened the shop early, swept the floor twice, and rearranged the display table by the window so many times that Priya would have laughed at her if she had been there to see it. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 9. Eleanor's heart did a strange little skip as she looked up, but it wasn't Vivian who walked in. It was Maya Chen, sharp-eyed and immaculate in a charcoal blazer, carrying a leather folder like a shield. "Miss Hart?" Maya's voice was polite but measured. "Eleanor, please." She wiped her palms on her skirt. "Can I get you some coffee? I just brewed a fresh pot." "I'm fine." Maya glanced around the shop with the careful assessment of someone who had walked into 100 different rooms and learned to judge them in seconds. "Nice place. Cozy. Thank you." Maya's gaze landed on the stack of children's books by the reading corner. "You run the weekend story time for kids?" "Every Saturday at 10, Eleanor said, relaxing a little. "We usually get about 12 to 15 kids. Last month we had a record 23, which was chaos, but the good kind." A flicker of something almost warm crossed Maya's face. "My boss likes that kind of thing. Community stuff. She reads the annual reports on every grant we give, cover to cover. That's unusual for a CEO." "You have no idea." Maya opened her folder and pulled out a check. "This is for the children's reading program. No strings attached. She asked me to make sure you knew that." Eleanor looked at the amount and felt her breath catch. It was enough to fund the program for 2 years. Maybe 3 if she was careful. "I can't accept this," she said, pushing the check back across the counter. "Not without knowing who it's from." Maya raised an eyebrow. "I told you, Ashford Media. That's a company, not a person. And I never applied for a grant. Someone reached out to me first, which means someone at Ashford Media knows about my little bookstore." Eleanor folded her arms. "I'm flattered and honestly a little overwhelmed, but I need a name." Maya studied her for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, but something shifted in her eyes. A recalibration. "You're not what I expected," Maya admitted. "What did you expect? Someone easier to intimidate?" Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. "I've been yelled at by a man twice my size who wanted a refund on a book he spilled coffee on. You're not scary." Maya almost smiled. Almost. "Fair enough." She tucked the check back into her folder and pulled out a card instead. "She said if you asked, I should give you this, but she also said you probably wouldn't ask." Eleanor took the card. It was thick, cream-colored paper with a single name embossed in dark green ink. Vivian Ashford. No title, no company logo, just the name, and a phone number written by hand at the bottom. "She said to tell you," Maya added, "that the change from the $10 is still sitting in her desk drawer. She couldn't bring herself to use it." The words hit Eleanor like a warm wave. She thought about the crisp bill she had pressed into Vivian's palm 2 nights ago, the way she'd wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. And now this. A small confession from a woman who seemed to collect walls around herself like other people collected books. "Does she always do this?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Send her assistant to deliver checks and cryptic messages?" Maya's expression flickered, something almost like sympathy passing through it. "She doesn't usually do any of this. I've worked for her for 6 years and I've never seen her write a personal note to anyone before." She paused. "I don't know what you did to her that night, but whatever it was, it got her attention. Use it carefully. Or what? Or you might break her heart." Maya said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that it took Eleanor a moment to process. Then Maya nodded once and turned toward the door. "The number is real. She answers her own phone most of the time, but if you call, make sure you have something good to say. She doesn't do small talk." The bell chimed as Maya walked out, leaving Eleanor standing in the middle of her shop with a cream-colored card in her hands and a strange, hopeful ache blooming in her chest. She didn't call that day. She told herself she needed time to think, to figure out what she even wanted to say. She made it through the afternoon, through the evening rush, through closing time. She was just about to lock the front door when she noticed a small brown package sitting on the doorstep, wrapped in plain paper, no return address. Eleanor picked it up and carried it inside. The package was light, about the size of a novel. She sat down at the counter and unwrapped it carefully, and when she lifted the flap, her hands went still. It was a book, old, beautifully worn, with a deep green cover and gold lettering that had faded in patches. She turned it over and read the title, and her breath caught in her throat. The Collected Poems of Emily Dickinson, a first edition, if she was reading the publication date right. She opened the cover, and there, in careful, elegant handwriting on the blank first page, was a single line. It gets easier. Eleanor sat in the quiet of her bookstore, holding a book worth more than her monthly rent, and thought about a woman in a camel coat who had stood in the rain and watched her close-up shop. She thought about the $10 bill in a desk drawer, and a check that had been tucked back into a folder, and a phone number written in green ink on cream-colored paper. She didn't know what any of it meant yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something that might change everything. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keypad for a long moment. Then she typed a single message and hit send before she could lose her nerve. "Thank you for the book. How did you know?" The reply came 3 minutes later, so fast she almost dropped her phone. "I saw you reading it that night. You were happy." Eleanor stared at the screen. The rain had started again outside, soft and steady against the windows, and the shop was warm and quiet, and somewhere in Manhattan a woman was sitting in a penthouse with a $10 bill in her desk drawer, and a copy of a book she had remembered from a single glance. She didn't know what she was stepping into, but she knew she wanted to find out. The text message sat in Eleanor's phone for 3 days before she worked up the courage to reply. "I'm glad you came that night," she typed, then deleted it. Then typed it again, then deleted that too. She was standing behind the counter at the Paper Nest on a drizzly Thursday afternoon, the shop empty except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. The cat, a gray tabby she'd named Muffin, was curled up on a stack of vintage cookbooks, flicking her tail every time Eleanor sighed. The bell above the door jingled. Eleanor looked up and her heart did something inconvenient. Vivian's with neck think in the doorway, shaking rain off her camel-colored coat. She wasn't wearing the sharp, commanding expression Eleanor remembered from the reading night. She looked almost uncertain, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be here. "Hi," Vivian said, her voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "Hi," Eleanor managed. Then, because her brain had apparently left the building, she added, "It's raining." Vivian's lips twitched. "It is. I have tea if you want some. It's cinnamon apple, my specialty." Eleanor winced at the word specialty, which came out slightly too bright. Vivian stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. "I'd like that." The shop was small enough that they could hear each other without raising their voices, and the rain made everything feel closer, more intimate. Eleanor busied herself with the kettle while Vivian wandered the aisles, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines of the books. "You have a first edition of Whitman here?" Vivian said, stopping in front of the poetry shelf. "My grandmother's. She left it to me along with the shop." Vivian turned, and for a moment her face was unguarded. "She must have loved you very much." Eleanor's throat tightened. She did. She poured the tea into 2 mismatched mugs, one with a chip on the rim, one with a faded sunflower painted on the side, and carried them to the small reading table by the window. They sat across from each other, steam curling up between them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eleanor admitted. "I wasn't sure I should," Vivian replied. She wrapped her hands around the mug, and Eleanor noticed her nails were perfectly manicured, but her knuckles were slightly red, like she'd been clenching her fists. "But I wanted to thank you, in person, for the book." "You already thanked me, in text." "That felt insufficient?" Eleanor studied her. The CEO of Ashford Media, sitting in a cramped bookstore with a chipped mug in her hands, looking like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't entirely understand. "You didn't have to come all the way here," Eleanor said gently. "You could have sent Maya." A flicker of something crossed Vivian's face. "I didn't want to send Maya." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with a meaning neither of them was ready to name. The lights flickered. Both of them looked up at the ceiling, and then the shop went dark. "Oh no," Eleanor breathed, already reaching for the drawer under the counter where she kept the flashlights.
The breaker has been acting up all month. I keep meaning to call the electrician, but, well, you know how it is." She found one flashlight, but the battery was dead. She rummaged through another drawer and came up with a box of matches and a half-burned candle. Vivienne was still sitting at the table, perfectly still in the darkness, and Eleanor could see the outline of her silhouette against the gray light from the window. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, striking a match. The flame flared and she lit the candle, setting it on the table between them. "This is not the elegant first meeting I imagined." Vivienne's voice came out of the half-dark. "You imagined a first meeting?" Eleanor's face went hot. "I meant a first proper meeting, with tea. And electricity." "I like it better without electricity," Vivienne said quietly. Eleanor looked up. In the candlelight, Vivienne's sharp features had softened, and she looked younger, less armored. The rain filled the silence, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I should help you find the breaker," Vivienne said finally.
Ending. "You don't have to. I want to." They moved through the darkened shop together, Eleanor leading the way with the candle, Vivienne following close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of her presence. They found the breaker box in the back storeroom, behind a stack of boxes labeled "Summer Reading." The switch was old and finicky, and it took them both, Eleanor holding the candle and Vivienne pressing the switch with a firm, practiced hand, before the lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness was almost jarring. They stood there, blinking at each other. Vivienne's hair had come loose from its usual neat twist, and a strand was falling across her forehead. Eleanor was still holding the candle, which had burned down to a stub. "You're very practical," Eleanor said, because she couldn't think of anything else to say. Vivienne's mouth curved into a genuine smile, small and private. "You're very kind." The words sat between them, not quite a compliment and not quite an invitation, but something in Eleanor's chest cracked open just a little. They went back to the reading table, where the tea had gone cold. Eleanor refilled their mugs, and this time she didn't sit across from Vivienne. She sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. Vivienne nodded. "Why did you come to the reading that night?" "The first night." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, and Eleanor watched the motion, hypnotized by the slow, thoughtful circles. "I was walking past," Vivienne said finally. "I'd had a terrible day, one of those days where you wonder if any of it matters, the meetings, the acquisitions, the numbers, and I saw the light in your window, the warm light. And I hear, think, someone laughing inside." She looked up, and her eyes met Eleanor's. In the dim light of the candle, they looked almost amber. "I just wanted to be somewhere that felt like that," Vivienne finished. "I didn't know you would be the one reading that poem. I didn't know you would look up and see me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The rain had stopped outside. The shop was quiet and warm, and the candle was burning low between them. When Vivienne reached for her mug, her hand brushed against Eleanor's. The touch was brief, barely a second, but Eleanor felt it all the way down to her toes. Neither of them pulled away. "Say it again," Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor blinked. "Say what?" "When you told me it was okay, the night I came in, you said, 'That's okay, I've got you.' I've been thinking about it ever since." Eleanor's heart was so loud she was sure Vivienne could hear it. "That's okay," she said softly, her voice wobbling. "I've got you." Vivienne exhaled a long, slow breath like she'd been holding it for years. They sat in the quiet for a long time after that, the candle flickering between them, not quite touching, but not quite apart. When Vivienne finally stood to leave, she paused the door. "The book," she said, "the one you sent me. I've read it 3 times. Eleanor smiled. "It gets easier, doesn't it?" Vivienne looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "I think it might." The door closed behind her, and Eleanor stood in the middle of her shop, the candle burning down to nothing, her hand still tingling from the brush of Vivienne's fingers against hers. Outside, the rain had stopped and the street lights was coming on. And somewhere in Manhattan, a woman was walking away from a little bookstore with a stack of Vivienne's.
familiar she hadn't had before. Eleanor didn't know what any of it meant yet, but she knew she wanted to find out. The call came on a Tuesday, 6 days after the blackout. Eleanor had just finished ringing up a customer when her phone buzzed on the counter. She almost didn't recognize the number, but the name that appeared made her hands go still. "Vivienne Ashford," she answered in the middle of the third ring, her voice coming out breathier than she meant it to be. "Hello?" "Eleanor." Vivienne's voice was low, unhurried, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it. Something almost careful. "I'm calling about the water stain on your ceiling." Eleanor blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "The back room. The ceiling, above the shelf with the gardening books. When the power went out and the breaker tripped, the water pressure in the old pipes backed up. I saw a small stain forming before I left." Eleanor hadn't even noticed. She'd been too busy replaying every second of that night to look up. Oh, it's really observant of you. It will get worse if the pipe isn't tightened. The building is old, and the joints have probably corroded. It's a simple fix, but the landlord won't get to it for at least a week." There was a pause. Eleanor could hear something in the background, faint, like the hum of a car engine. "Vivienne," she said slowly, "are you in front of my bookstore right now?" The silence that followed was just long enough to be an answer. "I was in the neighborhood," Vivienne said, and Eleanor had to press her lips together to keep from laughing, because Vivienne Ashford did not live anywhere near this neighborhood, and they both knew it. "It's supposed to rain tonight," Vivienne added, and there was something almost defensive in her tone, like she was building a case for herself. "If the drip starts again, the stain will spread to the books, the gardening section specifically. Those are expensive editions." "They are," Eleanor agreed, smiling so hard her cheeks ached. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Ashford." "Vivienne?" Eleanor's breath caught. "Vivienne?" she repeated, softer this time. Another pause, then practically. "I have a wrench in my trunk." So Eleanor opened the door to the sight of Vivienne Ashford standing on her stoop in a cream silk blouse and tailored charcoal trousers, holding a small red tool tote like it was a briefcase for a board meeting. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, and she was looking at the doorframe with the same intensity she probably used to read quarterly reports. "You brought your own wrench," Eleanor said, stepping aside. "I don't do things halfway." "No," Eleanor murmured, watching her step inside. "I don't think you do." It was strange seeing Vivienne in the bookstore in daylight, the last time she'd been here. Everything had been dim and candlelit, blurred at the edges. Now the morning sun streamed through the front windows, catching the gold in Vivienne's hair and the sharp line of her jaw. She looked out of place in the cozy clutter of the shop, all expensive edges and polished surfaces, but she also looked like she wanted to be here, which was the part Eleanor couldn't quite reconcile. Vivienne moved toward the back room with purpose, and Eleanor followed, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. The water stain was exactly where Vivienne had said it would be, a pale brown crescent blooming on the ceiling above the gardening section. Vivienne studied it for a moment, then pulled a step stool from the corner and climbed up with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor said, hovering at the doorway. "I can call a plumber. I can call my landlord. Your landlord has ignored 3 maintenance requests since October," Vivienne said flatly, inspecting the pipe joint. "I checked." Eleanor's mouth fell open. "You checked my landlord's maintenance records?" "I checked the building's service history. It's public record." Vivienne adjusted the wrench, her movements sure and efficient. "He's negligent. If I were you, I'd file a complaint with the housing department. But in the meantime, this will hold." Eleanor stood there, watching the most powerful woman in Manhattan media tighten a pipe joint above a shelf of gardening books, and felt something in her chest crack open just a little. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. Vivienne's hands paused. She didn't turn around. "I told you, the rain. It's not supposed to rain until tonight. The forecast changed." "Vivienne!" The name hung in the air between them, fogged and insistent. Vivienne's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Eleanor thought she'd pushed too far. Then Vivienne turned, just enough to look at her over her shoulder. The morning light caught her face, and Eleanor saw something there she hadn't seen before, something unguarded, something almost tender. "I wanted to make sure you were okay,"
Vivian said quietly. After the other night, the storm, the power, all of it. I wanted to make sure you were okay, and I didn't know how to say that, so I checked your ceiling for leaks. Eleanor's throat tightened. She stepped closer, stopping just short of the step stool. I'm okay, she said softly. I'm more than okay. Vivian looked at her for a long moment, and then she turned back to the pipe, but the tension in her shoulders had eased, and when she spoke again, her voice was lighter. The wrench, by the way, was a gift from a college roommate who didn't trust me to survive off-campus housing on my own. Eleanor laughed, surprised. Did you survive? I did. But I also paid a locksmith $300 to break into my own apartment in the first month. So the jury's still out. Eleanor laughed again, and Vivian's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. It was the first time Eleanor had ever seen her look even remotely sheepish, and it made her heart do something complicated in her chest. Vivian finished tightening the joint and lying down, wiping her hands on a cloth Eleanor handed her. The silk of her blouse was smudged with dust near the elbow, and there was a dark streak of grease across one wrist. She looked at it, then at Eleanor, and shrugged. It'll wash off. It's a very expensive blouse, Eleanor said. I'm sorry, I have others. That's not the point. Vivian looked at her, and so
Meaning shifted in her expression. What is the point? Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have the words. She just knew that watching Vivian Ashford kneel on the dusty floor of her back room, fixing a pipe she didn't have to fix, had undone something in her that she hadn't known was wound so tight. The point, she said slowly, is that you didn't have to come. But you did, and I don't know what to do with that. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then she said very softly, Neither do I. The words hung between them, fragile and honest. Eleanor broke eye contact first, busying herself with putting the step stool back against the wall. I'll make tea, she said, mostly to give herself something to do. I have this cinnamon apple blend I think you'll like. It's my rainy day tea. It's not raining yet. It will be. Vivian followed her to the front of the shop, and Eleanor put the kettle on in the small alcove she used for staff breaks. She was aware of Vivian behind her, standing in the middle of the bookstore, looking around like she was trying to memorize it. My mother used to have a bookstore, Vivian said suddenly. Eleanor's hands stilled on the teapot. She didn't turn around. She didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over the room. A small one, Vivian continued, her voice careful, measured. In a town you've never heard of. She ran it for 6 years, until the economy tanked and the bank took it. The kettle started to whistle. Eleanor poured the water slowly, letting the steam rise between them. She never opened another one, Vivian said. She never even talked about it after that. But sometimes, when I'm in a place like this, I think I understand why she loved it. Eleanor turned, holding 2 mugs. Vivian was looking
hatred with their shelves, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. What was the town called? Eleanor asked softly. Vivian blinked, coming back to herself. Larkspur, Colorado. Population about 2,000 if you counted the dogs. Eleanor smiled. I'd like to hear about it sometime. Vivian looked at her, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she reached out and took the mug, her fingers brushing Eleanor's in the exchange. The contact was brief, but it was deliberate. Eleanor felt it in her chest. Maybe I'll tell you, Vivian said quietly. Sometime. They sat down, not across from each other this time, but side by side on the small love seat Eleanor kept near the window. The tea steamed between them, and outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the glass. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The quiet had changed, from something uncomfortable to something shared, and Eleanor thought that maybe this was what trust felt like. Not a grand declaration, just 2 people, sitting in the warm light of a small bookstore, waiting for the rain to pass. When Vivian finally left, she paused at the door. Her silk blouse was still smudged, and there was a streak of dust on her trousers, and she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had stayed a little too long because she hadn't wanted to leave. The pipe should hold, she said, but I'll check on it. You don't have to. I know. Eleanor watched her walk to the car, and when Vivian looked back one last time, Eleanor raised her hand in a small wave. Vivian's mouth curved, just barely, and then she got in the car and drove away. Eleanor closed the door and stood in the quiet of her shop, the smell of cinnamon apple tea still in the air, the memory of Vivian's voice still in her ears. She thought about Larkspur, Colorado, population 2,000, a town she'd never heard of, and a woman she was beginning to understand. She thought about how Vivienne had said, "Neither do I," like she was just as lost as Eleanor was, and she thought, maybe that was okay, because they could be lost together. The first text came at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was still in bed, her hair a mess, the bookstore cat crawling on her ankles, when her phone buzzed against the nightstand. She blinked at the screen. A notification from a gossip account she'd never followed, shared by someone she barely knew in high school. The headline read, "Small-town bookshop owner sweet talks her way into a CEO's heart? We did the math." Her stomach dropped. She opened the link before she could stop herself. There was a photo of her and Vivienne outside the bookstore, taken from across the street. They weren't touching. They weren't even looking at each other. Eleanor was laughing at something Vivienne had said, and Vivienne was looking at her with that soft, unguarded expression she only ever wore when she thought no one was watching. But someone had been watching. The caption underneath was worse. It called Eleanor a small-time opportunist and a backwoods grifter with a book fetish. It suggested she'd engineered the entire relationship to climb the social ladder. It used words like calculated and predatory. And at the bottom, pinned to the thread, was a screenshot of a text conversation. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew that conversation. It was from 3 years ago, when Rachel had still been her girlfriend, when they'd still been trying to make things work. Rachel had asked her if she ever dreamed of doing something bigger, and Eleanor had texted back, "Honestly and sleepily, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be enough for anyone. Maybe I'm too small for this city." Rachel had kept that screenshot. Rachel had just posted it. The comments were already flooding in. Strangers calling Eleanor a manipulator, calling her pathetic, calling her a gold digger who'd finally found her mark. One person wrote, "She probably keeps a spreadsheet of rich women's addresses." Eleanor put the phone down. Her hands were shaking. She got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water that she didn't drink. She stood at the window looking out at the street, at the bookstore across the way with its warm yellow lights and its hand-painted sign, and she thought about all the people who would read that thread and believe it. She thought about Vivienne, and her chest tightened. By 9 o'clock, the story had spread. Maya called Eleanor twice and left one voicemail, her voice clipped and professional. "Eleanor, this is Maya. I need you to not post anything, not respond to anyone, and not answer your phone. I'll call you back within the hour." Eleanor didn't respond. She couldn't. She was sitting on the floor of the bookstore, the cat in her lap, watching her phone light up with a new notification every few seconds. By noon, the news had reached the Ashford Media Building. Vivienne was in a board meeting when the first murmur started. She didn't see the article herself until the meeting ended, when Maya handed her a tablet with the screen already open. Maya stood very still as Vivienne read, her face giving nothing away. Vivienne read the headline twice. Then she read the screenshot of the old text message. Then she read the comments, scrolling slowly, her thumb moving with deliberate calm. When she finally looked up, her voice was flat. "Who leaked this to the board?" "No one had to leak it," Maya said quietly. "It's on the public feed. The board follows the same gossip accounts the rest of the city does." Vivienne set the tablet down. She didn't look angry. She looked like a woman who had been here before, in this exact place, with a different face and a different scandal, and who knew exactly how these meetings were going to go. "They want a statement," Maya said. "They want you to publicly distance yourself from her." "I know what they want." Maya hesitated. "Vivienne, there are 3 major shareholders who've already called the General Council. They're framing this as a brand integrity issue. If you don't address it by the end of the week, they're going to call a vote of confidence." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And what do you think I should do?" Maya looked at her. For once, she didn't have a quick answer. "I think," she said carefully, "that you need to decide what you're willing to lose." Vivienne didn't say anything. She picked up the tablet again, scrolled back to the screenshot, and looked at Eleanor's old words. "Maybe I'm too small for this city." She thought about Eleanor's laugh, the way it filled up the dusty corners of that little bookshop. She thought about the way Eleanor had said, "I've got you," like it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about how small the city made everyone feel. Sooner or later. I handle it, she said, but she didn't say how. That evening, Eleanor closed the bookstore early. She turned the sign to closed, locked the door, and sat in the dark with only the cat for company. She didn't answer Maya's second call. She didn't open the article again. She just sat there, staring at the shelf where the poetry books lay, thinking about how foolish she'd been. She should have known. People like Rachel always found a way to make their poison feel like truth. Around 9 o'clock, she heard a car slow down outside. She looked up, heart hammering, expecting a reporter or a gossip blogger with a camera. But the car was a black sedan with tinted windows, and it didn't stop. It rolled past the bookstore, slow enough to be deliberate, and then continued down the street and out of sight. Eleanor watched it go. She didn't know if it was Vivienne. She didn't know if she wanted it to be. She pulled out her phone and typed a message, stared at it for a long moment, and then deleted it. Some things were too heavy to put into words. Some things had to be carried alone. The next morning, Eleanor woke up before her alarm. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the city waking outside her window. And then she remembered the black sedan from the night before. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence, a car that happened to slow down at a red light. But when she opened the bookstore at 8, she found a small paper bag on the doorstep. Inside was a single cinnamon apple tea sachet, the kind she brewed on rainy afternoons, and a folded note in handwriting she recognized immediately. It was short, barely 3 lines, and it said, "I heard the weather will turn cold this week. Stock up on tea. V." No phone number. No request for a reply. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she existed, that someone was paying attention to the small things. Eleanor pressed the note between the pages of a poetry book on the counter, right next to the cash register where she would see it every day. She didn't tell anyone about it, not her employees, not her regulars. It felt too fragile, too private, like a secret she wanted to keep warm. That afternoon, Maya called. Eleanor almost didn't pick up, but something in her chest told her to. "Listen," Maya said, her voice clipped and professional. "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I think you should know that the board meeting was intense. 3 of them wanted Vivienne to issue a public statement today. A formal distancing, you know the kind." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. "What did she say?" There was a pause. Then Maya let out a short, humorless laugh. "She said no, just no." She didn't explain herself, didn't justify it. She looked at them like they'd asked her to betray her own family and said no. I've never seen her like that. Eleanor closed her eyes. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She's always fine, that's the problem." Maya's voice softened, just slightly. "Look, I don't trust anyone who smiles as much as you do, but I've been watching her this week, and I've been watching her around you. I think you're good for her. Don't make me regret saying that." The call ended before Eleanor could respond. She stood in the middle of her bookstore, surrounded by shelves of stories, and felt the weight of what Maya had just told her settle into her bones. Vivienne had said no. For her. That night, Eleanor stayed open later than usual. She told herself it was because she had inventory to organize, but really she just wanted to see if the black sedan would come again. She brewed a pot of cinnamon apple tea, poured herself a cup, and sat by the front window with a book she wasn't really reading. At 9:15, the car appeared. Same black sedan, same tinted windows. It slowed to a crawl as it passed the bookstore, and Eleanor thought she could see a silhouette in the driver's seat, the shape of a woman with dark hair pulled back. The car didn't stop. It didn't need to. Eleanor watched it drive past and disappear around the corner. Her heart was beating too fast for something so simple. She thought about the note, about Maya's words, about the way Vivienne had looked at her in the candlelight of the blackout, like she was the only thing in the room worth seeing. She didn't have Vivienne's number. She didn't know how to reach her. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she couldn't let that silent gesture go unanswered. The next day, Eleanor bought a small battery-operated lantern from a hardware store. She didn't tell anyone why. That evening, after closing the bookstore, she placed the lantern on the windowsill of the front window and switched it on. It cast a soft, warm glow onto the empty street, a small beacon against the cold. She didn't know if Vivienne would understand. She didn't know if she would even see it. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she felt lighter than she had in days. The black sedan came again that night. It slowed in front of the bookstore, lingered a moment longer than usual, and then continued on its way. Inside the car, Vivian Ashford allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She had seen the light. For the first time in years, she felt like someone was leaving a lamp on for her. And she realized, with a quiet ache in her chest, that she wanted to be the one coming home to it. The week continued in that strange, silent rhythm. Eleanor would leave the lantern on the windowsill every night. Vivian's sedan would pass by, slow and deliberate, a quiet confirmation that she was still there. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them need think to. By Friday, Eleanor had started leaving the lantern on even before dark. It became a small ritual, a way of saying, "I see you. I know you're there. I'm glad you are." On Friday night, a different car pulled up outside the bookstore. It was a sleek silver coupe, and the woman who stepped out was wearing a long trench coat and dark glasses, even though the sun had set an hour ago. Eleanor recognized her immediately. Vivian stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking at the glowing lantern in a window. Then she walked to the door of the bookstore and knocked. Eleanor's hands were shaking as she unlocked it. When she opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, bringing with it the scent of rain and the faint, expensive perfume that had become achingly familiar. "Hi," Vivian said. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "I was in the neighborhood." Eleanor laughed, a soft, surprised sound. "You were in the neighborhood?" Vivian's lips curved into a small smile. "I brought you something." She held out a paper bag. Inside was a jar of honey, the expensive kind from a small farm in Vermont that Eleanor had mentioned once, months ago. "In passing, I remember," Vivian said simply. The tears came before Eleanor could stop them. She stood in the doorway of her bookstore holding a jar of honey, crying silently while the woman who ran a media empire watched her with something tender and unguarded in her eyes. "Don't cry," Vivian said softly. "I didn't mean to make you cry." "You remember everything," Eleanor whispered. "I said that once, just once, and you remembered." "I remember everything you say," Vivian said. She took a step closer. "I've been trying not to. I've been telling myself this is complicated, that you deserve better, that I should walk away and leave you alone. But I keep coming back to this street. I keep looking for your light." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Then don't stop coming." Vivian reached out, slowly, as if asking permission. Her fingers brushed Eleanor's cheek, gentle and cool. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she admitted. "I'm not sure I know how to be someone's someone." "Then we'll figure it out together," Eleanor said. She leaned into the touch. "That's okay. I've got you." The words hung in the cold night air between them. Vivian let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, and for the first time in days, she felt the knot in her chest loosen, just a little. The board meeting ended at 4 o'clock, and Vivian did not speak a single word for the rest of the day. Maya followed her into the elevator with a stack of printouts and a very specific kind of exhaustion that only came from watching grown executives argue for 3 hours about a woman they had never met. The vote had been close, but close was not enough. The final message had been delivered in the chairman's smoothest, most paternal voice. "Publicly distance yourself from the bookstore owner or submit your resignation by Friday." Vivian had said nothing when the words landed. She simply nodded once, stood up, and walked out of the room. That was the part that scared Maya the most. The silence. A shouting Vivian could be reasoned with. A silent Vivian was already somewhere else entirely. "Vivian," Maya said carefully as the elevator doors closed, "we have options. Legal options, PR options. I can have the communications team draft a statement that doesn't admit anything, doesn't deny anything, just buys us time." "No," Vivian said. "Then let me call the chairman. I'll tell him the rumors are baseless. I'll remind him that Rachel has a history of—" "No," Vivian said again. Her voice was quiet, not cold. That was the other thing Maya had learned to read. Cold meant she was angry. Quiet meant she was thinking. Quiet meant she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Vivienne walked past her own office and into the small kitchenette at the end of the hall. She poured herself a glass of water, drank half of it, and set the glass down with a precision that made Maya wince. "You don't have to do this alone," Maya said from the doorway. Vivienne turned, and for just a moment her careful mask slipped. Maya saw something underneath that she had only caught glimpses of in 4 years of working together. A tiredness that went bone deep, a loneliness that no corner office could fix. Then the mask was back, smooth and polished. "I've been alone for a long time," Vivienne said. "I'm good at it." "That's not the same as being happy." "No," Vivienne agreed, "but it's safer." She walked past Maya and into her office. The door clicked shut behind her. Maya stood in the hallway for a long moment, then pulled out her phone and typed a message to Eleanor. It was the first time she had ever reached out to the bookstore owner directly. The message was short. "He's not going to resign quietly. Just wanted you to know." The reply came back within minutes. "I know. I'm not going anywhere." Maya stared at the words for a long time. Then she put her phone away and went to find a very large cup of coffee. Vivienne sat at her desk with the lights off. The city sprawled below her, 1,000 glittering windows, and she thought about how strange it was that she had spent 12 things building an empire out of other people's stories, and yet she had never once told her own. The package was still in her bottom drawer. The book, the note, the tiny gold bookmark that Eleanor had pressed between the pages like a secret. She pulled it out now and traced the worn spine with her fingers. She had read the poems so many times that she could recite half of them from memory, but it was the note that she kept returning to. The simple handwriting on the slip of paper, "It gets easier." She had wanted to answer that note 100 times. She had wanted to write back, to explain that the woman who had sent her that book had somehow found the one piece of her childhood that she had never shown anyone. But Vivienne had spent her entire adult life learning how not to need people. The reflex was hard to break. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, expecting Maya with another update. Instead, it was a notification from a gossip account that Rachel had been tagging relentlessly for weeks. The new post showed a photo of Eleanor's bookstore from across the street, with a caption that made Vivienne's jaw tighten. "The little shopkeeper who thinks she can keep a CEO? Cute. Let's see how long that lasts." Vivienne set the phone down. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and began to type. It took her 2 hours to write the letter. She wrote it, deleted it, wrote it again, deleted it again. The words kept coming out wrong, too formal or too raw, too much or not enough. She had never been good at this, the messy business of telling someone what they meant to her. In business, she could negotiate a merger in her sleep. But this was not a merger. This was a confession. At 9 o'clock, she finally printed a single page. She folded it into an enveloped sheet, wrote Eleanor's name on the front, and set it on the corner of her desk. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and watched the city pulse below her, trying to remember how to breathe. The letter said 3 things. The first was an explanation she had never given anyone, the reason why she had walked into a small bookstore on a random Tuesday evening and had been unable to leave. The second was a truth she had been carrying like a stone in her chest, that she was terrified, not of the board, not of Rachel, not of losing her job, but of being seen, really seen, by someone who might then decide she was not worth staying for. The third thing was the hardest to write. It was only 1 sentence, and she had deleted it 6 times before finally leaving it in. "I don't know how to ask you to wait for me, but I'm asking." She turned away from the window and looked at the envelope. Then she picked up her phone and typed a message to the only person she trusted with the truth. "I'm not resigning. I'm going to fight. But I need you to know I'm not doing it for the company." Maya's reply came back almost instantly. "I know. You're doing it for her." Vivienne didn't respond. She didn't need to. She slid the envelope into her coat pocket, grabbed her keys, and walked out of the office. She drove through the late-night streets of Manhattan with the window rolled down, cold air biting her cheeks,
and she did not allow herself to think about all the ways this could go wrong. She parked across the street from the bookstore. The window was dark, but the porch light was on, and in the front window, a small battery lamp glowed warm and steady. She sat there for a long time holding the envelope, watching the light. She almost didn't get out of the car. She almost told herself that it was too late and that she was too broken, that Eleanor deserved someone who didn't carry so much damage. But then she thought about the note, the one Eleanor had sent her in a book of poems. It gets easier. Vivienne got out of the car. She walked across the street and slipped the envelope through the mail slot in the bookstore door. Then she stood there for a moment, her hand pressed flat against the wood, and whispered something that no one heard. "Please, please wait for me." She drove away without looking back. Behind her, the little lamp in the window kept burning, faithful and warm like a promise waiting to be kept. Eleanor found the envelope at 7 in the morning, when she came down to open the shop and nearly tripped over it on the mat. White paper, no stamp, no return address, just her name written in a careful, angular hand that she had seen exactly once before, on a receipt that said, "Keep the change." She picked it up like it might break. The porch light was still on from the night before, casting a pale yellow glow over the cold morning. She sat down on the bottom step of the stairs, right there in the doorway, and opened it. The letter was 3 pages long. The first page started with a confession that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "The reason I walked into your bookstore that night was not an accident. Maya had a list of bookshops within 5 miles of my office, all vetted, all professional. I asked her to find the one with the warmest light in the window. She thought I was being particular. I was being afraid." Eleanor read the line twice, then she kept going. "I have spent 12 years building a life where no one can reach me. I told myself it was strength. I told myself that needing no one was the same as being enough. And then you handed me a book of poems I had not thought about since I was a girl, and you said, 'It gets easier.' You did not know me. You had no reason to be kind. And you were kind anyway." The second page was harder. Eleanor could see where the pen had pressed down too hard in places, where the ink had smudged, where 3 lines had been crossed out so thoroughly that they were unreadable. "My mother opened a bookstore when I was 9. It was the only time I saw her truly happy. She would read to me after closing, sitting on the floor between the shelves, and I believed that if we stayed there long enough, nothing could hurt us. Then the landlord raised the rent. Then my father decided he wanted custody after all, not because he wanted me, but because he wanted to hurt her. She fought him for 2 years. She lost. She sold the store and we moved 13 times before I turned 16. She never opened another book again. She died when I was 22 and I was not there. I was in a boardroom, closing a deal I did not need, because I had convinced myself that if I was untouchable, I could never lose anyone the way I lost her." Eleanor's hand was shaking. She had to set the letter down on her knee for a moment and close her eyes. The third page had only 1 paragraph. It was shorter than the others, and it looked like it had been rewritten many times. The final version was barely 5 lines. "I am not good at asking for things. I have built my entire life around not needing to. But I am asking you now, Eleanor. Not because I have a plan, or because I know how to fix any of this. I am asking because I cannot stop thinking about your light in the window, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life being someone who drove past it. I do not know how to ask you to wait for me, but I am asking." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it to her chest, and sat on the cold floor of her bookstore, crying so quietly that the only sound was the soft rhythm of her own breathing. She did not call Vivienne. She did not know the number, for one thing, and, for another, she understood that some things could not be said over the phone. She opened the shop that morning, served coffee to her regulars, recommended a mystery novel to Mr. Chen, and did not tell anyone about the letter in her apron pocket. She carried it with her all day like a heartbeat. At 4 o'clock, the shop was quiet. The rain had started again, a soft gray drizzle that blurred the streetlights. And then the door opened. Vivienne stood in the doorway, wearing the same camel coat from the night of the reading, damp at the shoulders. She looked like she had not slept. She looked like she had been holding her breath for 12 years and had only now remembered how to let it go. They stood there for a long moment, the length of the shop between them. Neither of them moved. Eleanor was the first to speak. Her voice came out softer than she meant it to. I read your letter. Vivienne's jaw tightened. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. I know. I saw the light. I wasn't sure you would. She stopped, took a breath. I wasn't sure you would still be here. I told Maya I would not leave. I know. I didn't believe her. Eleanor took a step forward, then another. She stopped at the counter, her hand resting on the worn wood, and looked at Vivienne with an expression that made the older woman's composure crack, just slightly, at the edges. You said in your letter that you were afraid of being seen, Eleanor said. I want you to know something. I see you. I see the woman who sends anonymous books to strangers. I see the woman who fixed my shelves in a blackout because she could not stand to watch me struggle. I see the woman who drove past my bookstore every night for a week because she wanted to make sure I was safe and could not bring herself to knock. Vivienne's eyes were bright with something she was clearly fighting. You knew about that? I saw your car, same spot, every night, under the oak tree. Eleanor smiled, small and tired. You are not as invisible as you think. Vivienne let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped again, as if she was afraid to come any closer. I am not good at this, she said. Her voice was rough, almost a whisper. I am not good at being soft. I have spent so long being hard that I do not know if there is anything left underneath that is worth... Stop! Eleanor crossed the room in 3 strides. She reached up and took Vivienne's face in her hands, her thumbs brushing the sharp line of her cheekbones, and she looked at her with a tenderness that made Vivienne's breath shake. You asked me to wait for you, Eleanor said. I am not going anywhere. You do not have to be fixed. You do not have to be whole. You just have to be here. That is enough. That has always been enough. Vivienne's hands came up, hesitant, and settled on Eleanor's wrists. For a long moment she did not speak. Then she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed her forehead to Eleanor's. I have been alone for so long, she whispered. I forgot what it felt like to be held. Then let me remind you. Eleanor pulled her closer, and Vivienne went willingly, her arms wrapping around her like she was the last safe thing in the world. They stood time-tums and a sans bonnet, here in the middle of the little bookstore, the rain falling softly against the windows, and for the first time in Vivienne's carefully controlled adult life, she let someone hold all of her weight. They stayed like that for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the letter, worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded all day. Keep this, Eleanor said. Read it when you forget. I will be here to remind you. Vivienne took the letter, her fingers brushing Eleanor's, and she looked at her with an expression that held no armor, no distance, no fear. Say it again, she said quietly, the old phrase, the one she always used when she needed to hear something twice to believe it. Eleanor smiled. I've got you. Vivienne closed her eyes, and for the first time in 12 years, she believed someone. The rain stopped some time before dawn, leaving the streets of Manhattan slick and gleaming under the pale gray sky. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving softly in the tiny apartment above the bookstore. For a moment she stayed still, listening, letting herself believe it was real. Then she heard Vivienne humming, of all things, a tune Eleanor didn't recognize, and she smiled into her pillow. She found Vivienne in the kitchenette, wearing one of Eleanor's oversized sweaters that was too small for her shoulders, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. The CEO of Ashford Media looked completely out of place and utterly at home at the same time. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a long moment. You're humming, Eleanor said softly. Vivienne turned, and there was something in her face that Eleanor had never seen before. It took her a moment to name it. Peace. Sharp lines around Vivienne's eyes had softened, and her shoulders, usually held with military precision, were relaxed. I didn't know I was, Vivienne said, and she almost smiled. Almost. It's an old song. My mother used to hum it when she was sorting books in the shop.
Eleanor crossed the small kitchen and took the mug Vivian offered her, letting their fingers brush. Neither of them pulled away. "Do you remember the words?" Eleanor asked. "Not all of them." Vivian's voice was quiet. "But I remember how it felt. Safe. That's what I remember." They stood there in the little kitchenette, the morning light creeping through the window, and Eleanor thought about how far they had come. From a cold, rainy night in a bookstore with a woman who flinched at kindness, to this, to humming old songs and shared coffee and the quiet miracle of being seen. At 9 o'clock, Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face changed, the softness retreating behind a familiar mask. Eleanor watched her square her shoulders and become, in an instant, the woman who ran a media empire. "It's the board," Vivian said. "The meeting is at 11. Eleanor set down her mug and walked over to her. She didn't offer advice or reassurance. She simply reached up and straightened the collar of the borrowed sweater, letting her hands rest on Vivian's shoulders for a moment. "Go," Eleanor said. "I'll be here when you're done." Vivian looked at her, and the mask flickered. "You don't know what they're going to ask me to do." "I know what you're going to choose to do," Eleanor said simply. "That's enough." Vivian exhaled slowly, and something in her posture shifted. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Eleanor's, just for a breath, just for a moment. Then she pulled think, grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, and left without another word. Eleanor spent the morning in the bookstore, but she couldn't focus. She shelved the same 3 books twice. She made tea and forgot to drink it. The door chimed with customers, and she smiled and rang them up and handed them their change. But her mind was in a boardroom somewhere in Midtown, where Vivian was facing down the people who wanted her to choose between her reputation and her heart. At noon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Hart, it's Maya. She asked me to tell you she's fine. I don't know why she'd think you'd care, but there it is." Eleanor smiled at the screen. She typed back, "Thank you, Maya. And for what it's worth, I don't trust anyone who smiles that much either." A long pause, then. "She told you about the mug collection?" "She told me you have a problem." "Respect." Eleanor laughed out loud. Right there in the middle of the empty store, and a customer browsing the poetry section looked up in surprise. She waved apologetically and went back to her phone, typing one more message. "Tell her the coffee is still warm." Another pause, then a single word, "Copy." The afternoon passed in a haze of small tasks. Eleanor was rearranging the display table by the window when the door chimed, and she looked up, expecting a customer. Instead, she saw Rachel standing in the doorway, looking smaller than Eleanor remembered, thinner, less certain. "Eleanor," Rachel said, and her voice was stripped of the mockery from that first night. Can we talk?" Eleanor's hands stilled on the stack of books. She thought about the reading night, about the cruel words in front of everyone, about the social media posts and the fake screenshots and the avalanche of ugly think that had followed. She thought about Vivian, who had never once asked her to defend herself, who had simply shown up and stayed. "I don't think that's a good idea," Eleanor said quietly. Rachel took a step forward, then stopped. "I came to apologize, not for my sake, for yours. I was so angry and bitter about my own life that I wanted to tear down something beautiful. That was wrong." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. She saw the lines around Rachel's eyes, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides. She saw a person who had hurt her, standing in her bookstore, asking for something Eleanor wasn't sure she could give. "Thank you for saying that," Eleanor said. "I accept your apology, but I don't need anything else from you, Rachel. I have everything I need now." Rachel nodded slowly, something like relief passing over her face. "She's lucky," she said. "Whoever she is." Eleanor smiled, and it was a real smile, warm and certain. "I'm the lucky one." Rachel left without another word, and Eleanor watched her go, feeling something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, something simpler. Release. She turned back to the display table and finished arranging the books, her hands steady. At 6 o'clock, the door chimed again, and Eleanor looked up to see Vivian standing in the doorway, still wearing the borrowed sweater under her coat.
Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a tiredness around her eyes, but she was smiling, actually smiling. It transformed her whole face. "It's done," Vivienne said. Eleanor set down the book she was holding. "Done how?" Vivienne walked into the store and stopped in front of the counter, close enough that Eleanor could smell the rain on her coat. "I resigned, effective immediately. I told them I was leaving to start at Children's Literacy Foundation, and that I had already secured my first community partnership." Eleanor blinked. You quit?" "I didn't quit." Vivienne's smile widened, and it was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever seen. There's a difference. I chose the thing that matters." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the fundraising proposal Eleanor had drafted weeks ago, back when this was just a dream and a hope, back when she never imagined it would go anywhere. "I read it again on the way here," Vivienne said. "Your idea. A reading program for underserved kids, starting with your bookstore as the pilot site. It's good, Eleanor. It's really good. I want to build it with you." Eleanor stared at her, the words not quite landing. "You're serious?" "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." Vivienne reached out and took Eleanor's hand, her fingers warm and sure. "I spent 12 years building an empire that meant nothing to me. I don't want to spend another day building anything that isn't with you." The door chimed again, and Maya walked in, carrying a cardboard box that was clearly too heavy for her. She set it down on the counter with a thud and looked between them with a raised eyebrow. "Congratulations. You're both insane," Maya said. "Also, I found this in her desk drawer and I'm never letting her live it down." She reached into the box and pulled out a bag of marshmallows, holding it up like evidence. Vivienne closed her eyes. "Maya. Your CEO, everyone. The Ice Queen of Ashford Media, pillow-soft marshmallow enthusiast." Maya was grinning. "I've already texted the whole office." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and unexpected filling the little bookstore. Vivienne opened her eyes and looked at her, and the annoyance melted into something fond and unguarded. "I'll never live this down," Vivienne said. "I'll remind you of the time you hummed this morning," Eleanor said. "Consider us even." That night, they sat in the tiny apartment above the bookstore, the city lights glowing through the window. The proposal was spread across the coffee table, covered in notes and scribbles and coffee rings. Maya had left an hour ago, still clutching the marshmallows, forgetting to frame them. Eleanor leaned against Vivienne's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and gentle against the glass. Inside, the world was quiet and warm and full of possibility. "What do we do first?" Eleanor asked. Vivienne's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer. "We pick a name for the foundation. We find a space. We build something that lasts." "That's a lot of firsts." Vivienne turned her head and pressed a kiss to Eleanor's hair. "We have time. We have all the time in the world." Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself believe it. She thought about the night they met, about the rain and the cold and the cruel words and the door that opened anyway. She thought about the woman who had walked in wearing a camel coat and changed everything. "Hey," Eleanor said softly. "Say it again." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then, her voice low and warm, she said the words Eleanor had taught her, the words she now believed with her whole heart. "I've got you." Eleanor smiled against her shoulder, and outside, the rain kept falling, and the light in the window stayed on. In the spring, the foundation would open its doors. In the spring, the children would come, and the books would find their readers, and the little bookstore at gain. The edge of Manhattan would become the heart of something new, but that was later. Tonight, there was just this. 2 women, a small apartment, a shared dream, and the quiet miracle of being loved exactly as they were. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Let me know down in the comments. I'm actually really curious to see where everyone is watching from today, so drop your city or country below too. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button and subscribe. Catch you in the next one.